mass communication is ever expanding. If you take newspapers in this country, which has got about over 230 years of tradition, television is growing very rapidly. There are about 800 television channels which are available today, and television is likely to grow. So when we're talking about mass communication, we need to talk about print medium, we need to talk about television, we need to talk about radio, we need to talk about cinema. We also need to talk about another kind of a major media which is growing in this country called the social media. Let us now discuss about print media. India produces over 70,000 newspapers and magazines, and the circulation of newspapers is growing. Readership of newspapers is increasing as literacy is growing. In newspapers, we have got news, we have got information, we have got opinion, we have got feature articles, there is investigation. In newspapers, there are articles for women, for youth, there is political news, there is tourism news, there is social news, there is economic news, there is regional news, there is international news. Different kinds of information is available in newspapers. In addition to news, another kind of information which is there in newspapers are advertisements. 50% of the space in a newspaper is occupied with advertisements. There are different kinds of advertisements which are there in newspapers. There are product advertising. Someone is selling a product, he gives details about the product. There are corporate advertising. There are employment news. There is matrimonial advertisement in newspapers. There are different kinds of advertisements are there in newspapers. So in newspapers, we've got news and advertising. Both of them are important for readers. A lot of them are reading newspapers. Newspaper circulation and readership is growing in this country. Not only newspapers, but we also have magazines. Magazines relating to business, magazines relating to tourism, magazines relating to economics. There are political magazines, there are astrological magazines, there are magazines for children. According to various surveys carried out in this country, a lot of them are spending about 30 to 45 minutes on an average viewing television. Sometimes it's more. Again, in television, there are various kinds of programs. There are news programs, there are educational programs, there are entertainment programs, there are programs relating to information. Television is playing an important role in terms of catering to different kinds of need, to different kinds of people. Then, we have got radio. Radio has been all along playing an important role in India, particularly in rural areas. Now with the establishment of FM, frequency modulation, radio communication also got enhanced. Wherever you travel in a car, then you've got an FM radio. There is entertainment. There is some kind of information which is available on FM radio. So you need to be very familiar about what kind of a media are available, what kind of media should be used, what purpose we can go about using different kinds of media for different kinds of communication purposes. Then film is also a major media of communication in this country. Primarily, of course, an entertainment media. When you're talking about mass communication, it has got three functions. Number one is an information function. Two, education function. Three, entertainment function. And today we are also talking about infotainment. Entertainment combined with information. In communication, we are trying to inform people, we are trying to entertain people. So mass media can be effectively used, and we are using effectively mass media in India for communication purposes, for information purposes, for education purposes, for entertainment purposes, and for infotainment purposes, for influencing people, shaping public opinion in this country. So mass media play an important role. Another kind of a major media we have in this country is film. India is the largest film producing country in the world. Film is primarily an entertainment medium, but a lot of them want to get entertained. Sometimes, there is some kind of a social content we also give through the media, through film media. We are trying to educate people. We are trying to conscientize people. We are trying to make them conscious of certain social and economic problems of this country. When you go to a film theater, there's also something called a documentary produced by the films division. People who do not have access to television, they see the documentary, they get to know what is happening in the country, what are the major developments which are taking place in this country. So, media is growing very rapidly in this country. Television, in fact, in this country is revolutionized. We have got almost about 300 television channels in India, which are 24/7. All the time they are giving social information, political information, international information, business information. There are business channels, there are entertainment channels, there are news channels, there are educational channels. So one has to be familiar about using various kinds of media which are available in this country. I need to talk about the new media, the social media. Look at the way internet has revolutionized communication. Majority of the educated population today are only communicating through email. Some of them are communicating through the Facebook, through the Twitter. Social media also is playing an important role among the educated sections. As more and more people become literate, social media will become an important medium of communication. So, mass communication is a major communication media which are available for effectively using for various kinds of activities to inform people. Then comes the other kind of communication we need to talk about is interactive communication. Communication itself is interactive. Communication is a dialogue. Communication is not a monologue. Communication takes place between two people or more people. We must try to make our communication interactive all the time. We must encourage people to speak. In communication, what are we trying to do? We are trying to clarify. We are trying to explain. We are trying to give information. So we must try to ensure our communication is interactive. Who communicates with whom is important. Source to the receiver. I would like to give you 5 important stages in terms of all kinds of communication we talked about. Who communicates to whom? Source to the receiver. We should be very clear who is communicating and to whom are we communicating. When we are clear, then our communication is going to be very effective. Why are we communicating? The function of communication, the purpose of communication should be very clear. When our function, the purpose and the goal of communication is very clear, we will be in a position to communicate explicitly. We will be in a position to communicate clearly. The third important dimension, how does communication take place? What is the kind of a channel you want to use? We have talked about different kinds of mass media which are available. We talked about different types of communication. What is the kind of channel you want to use? Whether it is interpersonal communication, whether it is group communication, whether it is mass communication, whether you want to use internet for communication. Web-based journalism is growing rapidly. Web-based magazines are there. Web-based newspapers are there. Would you like to use that kind of a web-based media for communication? So we need to be very clear about the channel of communication. And when we are talking about channel, we also need to talk about the language we are using for communication. What is the language you want to use for communication? We need to be very clear. Do audience understand the language? That's an important factor in communication. I would say, what about? What are the contents? What are the objects of reference? What are the kinds of information you want to give? And what are the consequences of communication? All communication has impact. All communication affects people. What is the intended purpose of communication? What is the unintended purpose of communication? That is where the consequences of communication, you need to be very, very clear. Sometimes, if you send wrong information, it can have dangerous implications. The consequences can be very, very bad. Some time ago, a television channel telecast a broadcast news by giving pulse polio drops. 2 children died. And because without verifying information, that particular television channel telecast that news, the entire pulse polio campaign came to a halt because information got multiplied. Several people went to several kinds of places, hospitals, public health centers for getting their child vaccinated through polio drops. Because that particular channel gave wrong information saying that 2 children died because of taking pulse polio. It has enormous implications. The entire pulse polio campaign end. The entire pulse polio campaign went haywire, and we could not implement that particular campaign effectively. That's only one example I am giving. There are several kinds of examples. That is where when you are giving information, you must check your information. Your information must be precise. Your information must be exact. Your information must be based on facts. Information must be truthful. Honesty in communication is very, very important because we are communicating for people. That communication can have consequences. So that is where it is important who communicates to whom, why communicate, how does communication takes place, communication, what are the contents you are using in communication, and what are the consequences of communication. You need to be very, very careful. You need to take all the 5 above factors into consideration for when we are communicating. Then there are some more methods we can go about using for communication purposes. Telephone calls is a major form of communication. Now all of us are using mobile. Mobile also is playing an important role in terms of communication. The estimates in this country indicate there are about over 500 million mobiles in this country. You can communicate through exhibitions, posters can be used for communication, personal letters can be used for communication, websites can be used for communication, emails can be used for communication. Let us try to now look at what are the factors which are important in terms of various kinds of communication which we have talked about. We have identified different kinds of communication. We had verbal communication, non-verbal communication, oral communication, group communication, intrapersonal communication, interpersonal communication, mass communication, mediated communication, non-mediated communication, and then we also talked about using social media and other kinds of media for communication purposes. These are the factors you need to take into consideration much more seriously when we are talking about, because a lot of communication in this country takes place through oral communication, interpersonal communication, and in group communication. I would like to take 3 methods of communication, and I would like to identify for the benefit of you for effective communication when you are doing oral communication, when you are group communication, and interpersonal communication. In oral communication, interpersonal communication can only be successful when you are in a friendly atmosphere. You need to create a friendly atmosphere. You need to establish an understanding. And it is the responsibility of the communicator to create that kind of a friendly atmosphere. You should take initiative to greet a person. You should say good morning, good evening, or hi, depending upon with whom you are communicating. Personal greeting is important again in terms of communication. Personal greeting can be, dear Mr. Rao, how are you? When you use his word, dear Mr. Ravi, how are you? You are establishing a rapport with him. It's always better to use the name of the person because you are addressing him directly. Personal greeting is important. The third important factor is appreciation. You need to appreciate what the other person is saying. Appreciation plays an important role in effective oral communication. You need to appreciate. You can only appreciate provided you listen to the other person very carefully. You'll be in a position to appreciate his viewpoint. Appreciation is an important aspect in terms of oral communication. Personal interest. You must show awareness and interest in the listeners. As an individual, you must show interest in the person with whom you are communicating. Is an important expression of communication. The communicator, if he can open his speech with a smile communicate very effectively. You are giving an impression to the audience. You are happy to be communicating with them. To smile is an important feature in terms of oral communication. And a listener should feel important. You must always pay attention to your listener. He should feel important. If you are looking in the other direction, when you are orally communicating with him, or you are looking somewhere else, he is not going to be interested in listening. Listening is important. Listener's goodwill is important. Seventh dimension. Empathy is important in communication. Very important concept in communication. You are empathizing all the time with your audience. You are showing sensitivity. You are concerned. You are involved with your audience. Language is an important tool of communication. How simple is your language? What are the kind of words you are using for your communication purposes? Number 10, honesty in communication is important. You must be open in terms of your communication. Facts are important in communication. Honesty is important in communication. Then, the 11th important factor is personal appearance. How do you dress? What kind of a dress you are wearing gives a feeling. You are establishing a rapport. Depending upon the situation, you wear a good dress. The way you groom your hair also becomes important. The kind of a dress you wear for a particular occasion becomes important. And then the 12th important factor is action. Your physical movements are important. Your personal gestures are important. The way you behave, action would mean the way you behave becomes important. The 13th factor is humor. You need to amuse people. If you can use humor in your lecture, if you can use humor in your communication, people are going to pay greater attention. Audiovisual aids play an important role in terms of communication, in group communication. What kind of aids you are using for communication? Are you using color transparencies? Are you making a PowerPoint presentation? There are different kinds of methods which are available today. In terms of using audiovisual aids, you can use charts, you can use graphs, you can use tables for communication. You can show some pictures as part of your PowerPoint presentation. Handouts. Give some literature. Give some small write-up or note when you are communicating with people. In tourism, we call promotional literature. You are promoting a particular temple. You are promoting a particular tourist spot. You give a small handout of about 2 paragraphs or 3 paragraphs to your foreign tourists who have come, or to your Indian tourists who are there, about that temple, about that tourist spot, about that pilgrimage center. The 16th factor is accent, the way you speak. Accent is another important factor to be achieved in good speech. The way we communicate, the kind of an accent you are using, the way you pronounce a particular word becomes very important. Because sometimes we are dealing with cross-cultural situation. We are dealing with audience who come from different kinds of cultures. They need to understand your accent. So that's where accent becomes important. The way you pronounce a particular word becomes important. We may think we are speaking very well. We need to hear our own voice sometimes. Maybe you can practice your speech. You can record your speech on a tape recorder and then listen to your own speech. Then you will develop the ability of improving your speech. Most of the time, we take communication for granted. The 19th factor, which is important, style in speaking. The way you speak is important. The style should be suited to the audience and to the situation. The way you speak to children, the way you speak to adults, the way you speak to old people is different. The style of speaking varies from context to context, situation to situation, people to people. And then lastly, we need to pay attention to our dress. Costume is important. The kind of a dress which you wear is important. Through your dress, you are establishing a rapport. Depending upon the situation, depending upon the context, you wear a particular dress. We have identified group communication as one major form of communication. We need to take certain safeguards in terms of group communication. We must know when to enter into the discussion. Group communication is becoming a major method in this country in terms of trying to know the behavior of the people, the attitude of the people, whether he is an aggressive person, whether he is a humble person. They can make out through a group discussion. Group discussions today are judging behavioral attitudes of people. So that is where we need to know when to enter the discussion, how long we should speak in a group, when to wait for our turn. Are we giving others a turn in terms of group communication? Are we eliciting opinion from others? Or are we trying to dominate the discussion all the time speaking? Group communication is to elicit responses from others. You must be polite. Whenever you are intervening, you need to politely intervene in a group discussion. The purpose of a group discussion is to express opinion, give suggestions. Are we giving opinion? In group communication, we are expressing agreement. There can be disagreements. How do you express your agreement and disagreement becomes very important in group communication. You can politely disagree. Sometimes, if you want to seek a clarification, how do you seek a clarification in a group discussion? Can I please seek a clarification? Can you please explain that again? If you are shifting from one issue to another, how do you go about shifting, initiating a topic shift? You need to be restrained and controlled if you do not agree with a point of view. You may be disagreeing with a point of view. That point of view, that opinion may not be acceptable to you. But then the way you express your opinion becomes important in group communication. It's a participatory communication. We are allowing others to participate in that communication. You should not monopolize communication. You should allow others to express your viewpoint. 3 important stages I want to talk about. The objectives of communication ought to be specific to the audience. Number 2, they should be relevant to the audience. And information must be timely. And all different kinds of communication are important. We talked about intrapersonal communication. We said intrapersonal communication is talking to oneself in one's own mind. 2, we talked about interpersonal communication is the exchange of message between 2 persons. It can be a conversation, it can be a dialogue. We talked about group communication. Group communication is among small or large groups. Then mass communication. In mass communication, we've talked about newspapers. Primarily, mass communication occurs when the message is sent to large groups of people. That is why it is called mass communication. By newspapers, magazines, radio, television, film, and now social media. That's mass communication. Then we talked about verbal communication, means communicating with words is verbal communication. Non-verbal communication includes pictures, signs, graphs. There are various kinds of communication. We have talked about it. Keep this in mind. The ultimate purpose of communication is to inform and to persuade people. If you can keep this major factor in mind, communication is to inform people, communication is to give specific information to people, communication is taking the needs of the audience into consideration and give them relevant, timely information. The second important factor in communication is to persuade people. Not only give information, we have to motivate people in communication. We have to change their attitudes. We have to persuade them. We have to make them think. Ultimately, they must make use of the information for a better society, for better relationship. That is what is important in terms of communication. Communication is challenging. Communication is complex. But however, if we can follow all the factors we discussed in terms of communication, we will be very effective in communication, and we will be in a position to inform people very well. The purpose of communication is to bring about change in people, change in attitude, change in behavior, change in thinking,